And we've got a treat today. Sunny Wescott's here to speak about extreme weather events. And this is a timely and very interesting topic to hear from. Sunny Wescott's a federal emergency response official chief meteorologist with the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, specializing in national extreme weather hazards and climatological studies for impacts to public and private sector key resources. During her time in the U.S. Air Force as a lead meteorologist, Ms. Wescott trained on continental and oceanic weather as a top forecaster for a support region and is considered a subject matter expert for multiple climatological events such as drought, subsidence, wildfires, tropical cyclones, and winter storms. While previous roles within CISA focused on working with emergency response operations for telecommunications, critical infrastructure, and executive briefing support, which integrated her background in operational forecasting from a military experience, Ms. Wescott's current role with CISA Infrastructure Security Division, Assistant Chief of Staff Office, enables extreme weather outreach by providing focused reports for regions and critical infrastructure operators before, during, and after disasters. So, a warm welcome to Ms. Sunny Wescott.
Hi, I'm gonna run a timer so I don't go too far over on time. Wow, this is really warm. I was gonna put my jacket back on, but this is. Ooh. I might actually. No, I'm gonna need the microphone. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Sunny Wescott. So as was mentioned, I'm a prior Air Force forecaster. So I talk about this speed. It'll actually increase as we go forward. And then I move my hands, but I will usually stay put. I'm pretty upbeat in a lot of what I'm going to be presenting, but a lot of it is going to be very negative. So if you have any questions on the tail end of it, or you need, a hug or something, it's definitely something that can be discussed. So what we're going to be talking about is the impact of some of the climatological events, not just the impact in the sense that it's worsening, it's destroying things, our critical infrastructure is getting weak, it's old, it's falling apart. Also the impacts that we're going to have to the human body, to our wildlife, to everything that we utilize within the operational supply chain, key resource hubs. There's a cascade of impacts that kicks off. So, ooh, I had I guess somebody can have a hot mic. Yeah. Okay. Marvelous. So what you can see here is where we're starting this year against the 10 hottest years on record. This is pretty well received across the board for most people. We have a general understanding. Right now, it may be colder across different pockets of the US, but to note, Australia is currently having the hottest temperatures, 105 plus degrees across the northern portion of the country going on right now. We also have numerous flooding events that have kicked off. A lot of people saw that Spain most recently had a pretty significant 2 months worth of rain fall in about 9 hours. We had the same 2 months of rain fall in the Philippines and in China the week prior. So we are starting to see a lot of these correlating effects, and why extreme heat is able to amplify those we'll talk about here in a second. So, ooh, did I push the button? Hang on. Button doesn't work. I'm gonna go to this one. Nope. It also doesn't work. There we go. Now we'll go back. Now we'll go forward. Marvelous. All right, so what we've got here is the changes in the upper atmosphere. So a lot of people, when they talk about climate change, they talk about the symptoms as opposed to chasing it back to the root issue, which is that the low pressures and the high pressures are shifting. That's our big concern. When you see a change in the upper level lows, which drive all of your weather events, so your lows drive your wind, your flood, your hail, your tornadoes. Lows are both our continental systems that extend from Canada to Mexico. They have that giant wall of weather that comes across, why Oklahoma got tornadoes yesterday. And then lows are also our tropical system. Those are also cyclonic in nature. So those are our hurricanes, tropical storms, typhoons, all of which are the same. They're all changes in low pressures. The difference between a hurricane and a continental system is a hurricane forms borderline from the surface, whereas a continental system forms from the top of the atmosphere down to the surface. What that does is when you have an upper atmospheric low, they are what I refer to as ultimate weather features. They drive everything across the globe. Both hemispheres get them. They move in a continuous belt along what I refer to as the carousel of weather. That carousel of weather looks a little bit like this, where you have lows and highs. You always have a high between the lows. So it's always a nice sandwiching effect. These horses on a carousel, the lows being your horses, can go north and south. So that up-down variation like on a carousel, but always progressing in the same direction. Same thing for our northern hemisphere. All of our lows for the US, for example, come in from the west and exit to the east. They do have some north-south variation, so they can enter from the Pacific Northwest, they can enter from Central California, or they can enter from the border with Montana and Canada, and then they drop along the Front Range, lift up along the Mississippi River system, climb up and over the Appalachians and out into the Atlantic, over to the European continent or Northern Africa, crossing that, going across Asia, and then coming back out into the Pacific, then over to the US again. So any changes in that merry-go-round are going to impact all of the storm systems that we're used to seeing. Deeper lows means stronger winds on both the lead and the back end, which means, yes, twofold. You get more rainfall from deeper lows. They're pulling from the top of the atmosphere down, slamming all that moisture on top of you. Absolutely. However, stronger winds, much like using a hairdryer, suck all that moisture right back out again. So while you may say, oh, we haven't gotten rain in about a month because we've been in a blocking pattern, there's been too much of a high pressure camped out, not enough low movement because they're slowing down because they're bigger, heavier hitting lows. Subsequently, that wind, as it comes in, is going to pull all that moisture right back out. So it's not going to be as beneficial. You're still going to see your entire season, your entire year's worth of rain. It's just not going to be evenly distributed like we're used to it being. It's going to be hyper condensed events that are thereby less beneficial. They do more damage and they immediately return back to the atmosphere to slam you once again on the back end. What that looks like, I know a lot of you in the back are like, I can't read that. Absolutely, you can't. However, this will be available in PDF format. You can go through all of these slides and all the fun studies and statistics that are in there. I like to share all of this information. A lot of what I do is available on open source as well. Just if anybody has any questions or they have conflicting information, we're able to hash that out. What you're looking at here is all of the different trends that can come from changing that part of the carousel. So a deeper low pressure adding to increased sediment flow, sediment being when the water comes down too fast, scoops up the surface of the earth and drops it into the rivers. That's a problem because it fills the rivers from the bottom up, reducing the capacity of the river system. There, by the next major flood event that comes in, the river can't actually hold that water, ends up releasing it at a variable rate. That floods into communities at different levels where communities have never flooded before, but they weren't used to the fact that downstream now can't hold that water, or upstream. Subsequently, you can also see that flashier flash floods. That's just more rain at once. Your flash floods taking on a more extreme tagline to it. Same thing with your wind events. The hotter it is, the more intermixing winds you're able to see. Those winds can do a lot more damage to your transmission systems. They're able to do more damage to your vegetation, to your trees. We're also starting to see that higher heat, the direct solar radiation, does a lot more damage both to the human body and the wildlife, but also to our vegetation and our soil content going forward. So you're going to notice that each one of these kind of fuels the other, but they all come from the same baseline start, which is a deeper low pressure center. What we talk about here in CISA, so CISA is the critical infrastructure side of the house, is what I work on. I've broken out climate shifts in general into 8 main weather events that are amplified by the uneven distribution of heating. So I know a lot of the pushback that we get across the climate industry is, it was once hotter way back when, or what about winter, it's cold now, there and by it's not global warming. And you're like, oh, that's awesome. I love that as an argument point because it's very small against a very large average. When you look at the overall implications, when people say it once was hotter, that's cool. None of our stuff was here then. We didn't build to that. We built it to a very specific climatological norm. So it doesn't really matter if 200 years ago it was hotter, if everything we built was in the last 70 years, for example. It's kind of a moot point. So you're able to meet them where they're at on that. And I recommend doing it as opposed to trying to convince them that the shift is outside of norm. You just say, we didn't build to that. Our cement has a break point. We're hitting break point now. What are you doing about it? And that puts the power in their hands. Sea level rise, same thing. I get a lot of pushback about sea level rise. Easy way to explain that to people. If you put water in a pot on the stove and you boil the water, some of it evaporates out, absolutely, but it ends up boiling over, but it was all the same amount to begin with. The earth has the same amount of water that it started with that it'll end with, right? We all know this as a baseline fact. Some people think that it came in from a comet. That's been disproven recently, if you haven't seen that in the news. It is permeating from the core of the earth. And that subsequently means that we only had such amount of water. So if we continue to heat, it absolutely come up and into the upper atmosphere, but it also means the direct surface will expand as well. And that causes flooding at some of our gulfs, some of our lakes, areas where you wouldn't necessarily attribute sea level rise to be a factor, but it is. So there's definitely different ways that you can communicate each one of these threats to different stakeholders. This is the graphic that I choose to utilize when I talk to critical infrastructure owner operators. World War I and World War II occurred during this time. Everything that we use across the US was built in this window. Almost all of our dams, I think it's something like 97% of our dams, 98% were put in this time period. And anything outside of that's been modified since then anyway, so it falls in this window. So if you say my home was built in the 1970s, it's probably built using climatological averages from the 1920s. Thereby, you're able to say, were they anticipating the temperatures, the precipitation, the humidity levels that I see now? Was insulation considered back then? Did they aerate the cement for my driveway, for this, for that? Likely not. When you look at this and you're able to say it's getting hotter, what does that mean? Just like a sauna, you can make it incredibly hot and incredibly humid. It will not rain in a sauna. You can't make a thunderstorm in there, but you can make it deadly. Same thing with the atmosphere. It can get incredibly hot and incredibly humid. Without a low pressure coming in at a continuous rate, it will not rain. It will just become more hostile to the things that we've built and your body. You will continue to try to sweat. Your sweat will not be accepted in the atmosphere, and you will cook from that. So what does it look like as we go forward into the future? It doesn't look any more positive. One side of the US will get more direct solar radiation. Less humidity means a lot more sunburns on one side. That's how that ends up happening. If you've traveled and you're like, oh, the temperatures are the same, but I definitely burned here and I didn't burn there, it has a lot to do with where humidity is permeating. So where it's drier, you have a lot more damage. That's the aridification aspect of it. So you'll see the western half of the US, regardless of where our frontal boundaries come in or the amount of flooding they see, the moisture that they see is getting pulled right back out again, faster than the eastern side of the US because of humidity levels. So when we're tracking these changes across the board, it's not just us, everyone's playing this game. On a global scale, every country, every continent is reporting record-breaking temperatures, flooding events, tropical cyclones taking on greater intensities, wildfires that are ranging out of control, burning a lot faster because the winds are driving them, but the vegetation's also decayed at a faster rate. That means more smoke is available in the atmosphere as well. Smoke does one of two things. One, harmful to inhale, absolutely, a lot of us know that. Two, it also distributes the amount of moisture in a cloud. So a lot of us thought cloud seeding was going to be the answer going forward. And an interesting fact about wildfire smoke is that as it dirties the air, we get more cloud coverage, but we don't get the rain. So it actually moves across at a horizontal level. Those water molecules break up instead of staying together, bonding and falling. So the more wildfire smoke that we see, the less rainfall we see. Subsequently, dirtying the air actually comes with negative consequence, very similar to pollution. So when we're looking at this, is we're talking about every country across the Northern Hemisphere doing some level of cloud seeding for the last 20, 25 years. This is a really interesting notion for where we're seeing drought worsen, at what rates and why, despite doing climatological modifications. So when people advocate at the back end, Sonny, what should we do about this? Got to fix the surface, not the atmosphere. And then you'll notice that some of our record breaks that have happened recently, we're obviously entering some of the longest streaks. September was actually notably cooler, which is the only positive that we have, but only by a very small margin that knocked us out of the continuation. So this touches a little bit more on some of the studies that have come out recently attributing some of the barometric impacts to the human body, but everything that we experienced, everything from back in the day when people would say, my knees hurt, so I know a storm is coming. I know it's going to rain. I'm sad there and by it rains, or it rains and then I get sad. All of these different interlinks that we've seen since before the medieval era, when people were keeping journals and they were attributing a lot of this, they didn't understand what they were actually reporting, is that your body is predominantly a liquid, and a barometric low when it comes in just pushes liquid down. If you've ever seen one of our barometric sensors, it's just liquid in a vial that has a spout, and the deeper the low, the more water comes out of the spout. Your body is just a container, and the low comes in and it smushes all the liquid in your body, and that pushes on your muscles, your membranes, your bones. So the more damage your body has, the more you can feel the low. You're a barometric sensor. What this does is if you're pregnant, it can push you into labor. The same thing happens with our livestock. With fish, it pushes them deeper down. So you'll notice that some of our fish accidentally kind of committing mass suicide because they're diving down and imploding a little bit. That's a problem. So when we're looking at some of the different ways that this can impact the body, it's everything from migraines, headaches, joint pain, to the livestock shifting, to birth rates shifting, suicidal ideation, that depression, because during that time frame when you're in pain, your body feels compressed, you feel lethargic, you don't want to move. It's very hard to think outside of that haze to what next week will look like. So you're stuck in this moment of what the next 6 hours is going to look like, and it's easier to commit to those kinds of ideations because you are unable to pull yourself out of it. This is also a very interesting nugget that's going into one of my papers that's coming out next month, is the decrease in crime during certain barometric low pressure days. So whether it's winter or it's summer, we've noticed, and the police have noticed too, whether or not they have that as an attributable, they've noticed a decrease in certain crimes during these low pressure days. They're like, oh, people don't commit crime when it's raining as much because they don't like rain. And I'm like, I don't think that stops most criminals, to be fair. But it is a certain depth of low that actually ends up resulting in that. So there's some really interesting nuggets about high pressures as well. So we have the lows that cause suicidal ideation, lethargy, a lot of pain, migraines, a lot of where you kind of shut down. High pressures cause the opposite of that. You're actually far more aggressive. You have the energy to commit crime, which is interesting. And the type of crime is usually more on the anger side of the house. So as somebody from the military, I have anger issues, and during the summer, they are notably worse. I also identify with a lot of these studies. As I'm reading it, I'm like, it's not me. I'm not the problem. It's the atmosphere. My friends don't agree with that, but you'll notice that a laboratory experiment where you trap people in a room and you make it hot, you can make them destroy stuff or attack each other. So there's a lot to be said about the mad scientist side of the house having room for exploring if anybody's looking for career shifts. You'll also notice that heart attacks go up. And that's a very interesting thing because it's a heart attack on either side of the barometric shift. So deep or low, heart attack. Too high of a high, heart attack. Your body naturally wants a continuation of a sustainable margin of barometric shift. So the more that we're saying there's a change in the barometrics, the more this is a concern for us being able to operate as well as our animals. So you'll notice that violent crime, obviously a major concern. Terrorism is also up on there. So more people go outside, whether it's winter, whether it's summer, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's 125 degrees. People will go outside in that temperature during a high pressure day. They'll look outside, they're like, sun's out, I need to go out. And you're like, no, please don't. You could die in the heat wave and or people might attack you and they will still go out and do it. So this creates a higher body count and then subsequently more attacks of opportunity. So it's not just one thing. It's not just it's hot, so you're likely to commit a crime. It's that you're hot, you're uncomfortable, you're more likely to release that energy in some capacity. Road rage goes up, destruction of property, you're just more likely to lash out. Also has immediate implications on your ability to do work. So you'll see some of the different studies here. Hate tweets go up across the board. So that's an interesting new age thing, but we also had hate speech that used to go up, and then you would have people who would just aggress upon others. So when you go back in time, you'll notice that Mississippi's on here from 2022, but we also had the last one that was on here, 1988 was one of the hottest summers on record for that time period. And they had record-breaking crime that affiliated with that. So you're able to track this back a good couple of decades. This isn't, oh, just in the last 5 years, Sunny's pulled a lot of these studies. No, but you'll notice that this year, Portland saw a very interesting thing. As soon as it got hot, the first thing I did was I was just like, I wonder what their crime rate looks like. First headline. And I was like, ah, marvelous. That's immediately interesting because the amount of outdoor venue activity was also going up. People wanted to go to shows, concerts, events. And then now you're starting to see that people are going to be more aggressive. They're going to be more hostile. They're less likely to listen to authority. They're less likely to take direction as well. So this becomes a major issue just across the board on the violence and aggression side of the house. But it's not just us, it's the animals. So fun fact, dogs are more likely to attack people on higher UV days as well. That's both your dog and any other dog, I guess, that you would interact with. But it's also the same thing when you're looking at aggression in rats and monkeys. So this is also across the board, just an interesting correlation. You'll see some of the other ones, like some of our large cats moving into populated areas. Not just a problem because obviously you don't want them there, but also some of the shifts in where like sheep are moving. So sheep moving into certain regions, globally eating the crop, and then subsequently who follows the sheep, the large animals that are predatory, now moving into your area. So the sheep has come in, destroyed your crop, and then they get eaten anyway. So you end up seeing a lot of these correlating factors. Alligator attacks are up, shark attacks are up. This is continuing across the board. We're also seeing a really cool change. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner, left-hand corner, whatever, up in the corner, you'll see a change in our fish size. So warmer water is a very interesting study about that. Some fish get bigger, some get smaller. Most go through sexual maturity a lot earlier and they die earlier. So we're seeing that they're getting bigger and they're dying faster. So this actually tracks with what we used to see way back in the day when we look at dinosaur fossils, right? And we're like, wow, that was a really big fish. Why don't we have those now? It's actually a cooling in the water system that allowed for a lot of that environmental shift. As it gets warmer, they too will get bigger. Same thing with the sharks, same thing with the gators. They're also getting larger. Snakes aren't hibernating as much. That's a huge problem in the desert Southwest. Some bears are reportedly not hibernating for as long. And then, of course, we're seeing the shift of where some of these creatures are at. So things like the polar bears leaving Alaska, going over to Russia. Major concerns with that. So as we're looking at this, that we're taking it holistically. It's not just us, our bodies are weakening, our stuff is weakening, the weather is getting worse. It's also the general environment, the biome in which we're operating in. If you have a disaster, your house floods out, your whole community is outside a lot more often, you're more likely to interact with something that's on here. Snakes, scorpions, tarantulas, all starting to be a lot more aggressive. Flooding events from major storms, driving snakes and spiders into people's homes, into their tents when they're camping. I went to the Blue Ridge Rock Festival before it went bankrupt. I didn't go this past year. This past year, they had a major hailstorm event kick off. Took a bunch of the tents, threw them into the trees, pelted everyone with hail who was out on the stage, the handicap ramp, all the ADA people were essentially on a platform, just being absolutely decimated by this hailstorm. Everyone else dove under it, and then the flash flood half drowning them. So then you ended up going back over to your tent, and you're in a panic. You go into your tent is now filled with spiders and snakes. And that was reported across the board. And so you weren't really safe anywhere you were in that moment. But you paid hundreds of dollars to be there and they did not get refunds. So they went bankrupt. So if you're looking at like, what does this look like at a festival? That's what it looks like going forward. It's not great. Some of the other psychological impacts, obviously everything I'm telling you now, people are like, Sunny, I'm really sad. This is upsetting. I'm like, yeah, you're on here now. 7% of American adults experience mild levels of climate change psychological distress. You're welcome. And so what I do is I obviously, one, contribute to these studies, but I also consume them. So you can see here just the increase in mental health concerns across the board. At least everyone's starting to pay attention. So we have some positive information with that. We're starting to see an increase in some of the different age groups paying attention. And that's by the anxiety notion. So, something to be said about at least being able to track that with medication. So you're able to say, well, we're prescribing anxiety medication to these age groups in these periods of time in these specific areas hit by a major weather event. You'll also see some of the other interesting statistics. A lot of these, again, correlated just across the board. So you'll notice that China came out with a really interesting study where they were testing students at differing high heat days to see just how much it was impacting their cognitive ability. And they ended up reporting that on extreme heat days that they were losing about a year's worth of education just in mental capacity. They were just exhausted to run down. Florida reported the same thing despite having HVAC cooled facilities because you're walking to and from school, your time between classes, everyone who's coming into the classroom whose body is physically hot. If you ended up taking public transportation, maybe your bus didn't have AC, it didn't really matter if in the moment you were cooling down, you were taking psychological distress at home and in transport. So there's a lot of interesting studies about heat stroke survivors taking permanent damage. That's an interesting problem set if we're talking about, oh, these events are getting worse, but maybe you only suffer one summer. That might be permanent damage going forward on your cognitive capabilities. And obviously we're concerned about that across the board. Some of the other fun things, obviously methane in the atmosphere is a significant issue. Methane's not in and of itself the thing that we're tracking as much as we're tracking tropospheric ozone and the impact that that has on your body as well as on our crops. So you'll notice that that's increased by about 12% during many of your lifespans. And what that looks like, as you can see with the mice that we exposed, that they weren't able to heal as fast. So every time that they took damage, whether it was bone, muscle, or tissue, they weren't able to recover at the same rate. So this is more than just all our stuff is breaking. It's also that we're degenerating based off of the changes that are happening in the atmosphere. We're not as sound as we used to be. So when people say, why is it so much worse now than it was in the 80s? Everything is different. The storms are stronger. They're producing more damage. Our stuff is breaking at faster rates. We're being forced to experience all this with the knowledge that we don't actually have the ability to take action to stop it right now. So all of us coming to the same conclusion, this is all terrible, Sunny. Why is it going up so fast? How do we make it stop? Unfortunately, you can't make it stop at this point. We are on what is I refer to as like a tidal wave. We're upon it, so you're stuck riding the tidal wave. Your goal now is to prevent additional tidal waves on the back end. So unfortunately, the majority of this is just negative information that says you can stave off impacts and damage. You're still going to experience them, but you can reduce them. You can reduce how much it disrupts your life, and you can work on the bigger mission set, which is ensuring just the longevity of grandchildren, essentially, not really the current children. I have an 11-year-old. So when we're looking at this, it's not just us in our day-to-day, it's also the people that we rely on in a disaster. When we're talking to first responders, if you need CPR and the ground is 135 degrees, you're getting a burn. That's almost a guarantee, but so is your first responder. They're likely also getting second-degree burns, putting you on the ground to commit to that. We're also seeing that across the board. A lot of them are not aware of just how much damage they're taking on. If you've noticed, police officers' uniforms are black. We know the difference between a black car and a white car in the summer is one is obviously significantly hotter, retains way more heat. Their cars also typically darker. Their connectivity parts are mostly metal. You've seen it with their walkie-talkies, their clips. Same thing with the external parts of a fire truck. Even though it's a brighter vehicle, it's still predominantly metal they're interacting with. Fire hydrants. All of these different things that our first responders are touching. If we pass out and they go to react to us and they need to sit down on a park bench and that park bench is too hot. Same problem set. The metal grating where our at-risk communities might be sleeping at night because it's warmer and the air is cooler, those during the summer, searing hot. Huge issues across the board with just everything that you're interacting with and then the damage it can do to the body. So a big part of this is one, making sure that they're aware. A lot of them are not tracking. They're in regions, states where it's never gotten that hot. Areas like Montana reaching 118 degrees. That doesn't really sound like something you would expect to talk to a cop about. It's like, hey, what does it look like if you were for a week in Arizona? And they're like, well, I don't live there. Well, now you do for this week. You live in Arizona. What does it mean to touch everything? Arizonians know we don't touch metal clips of our seatbelt buckles. We have coverings over our steering wheels. Our windshields will blow out. We know not to keep our phone in direct sunlight. It will explode. Same thing with a lot of our other things, tablets, any MP3s, anything that's electronic, lithium ion batteries in full, those scooters, the bikes, anything like that. If you have a battery assist bicycle and it's in your backyard, the odds of that exploding go up through the roof as well. So this touches a little bit more on specific types of crime, murder rates, obviously, showcasing a lot of those attack of opportunity potentials, but we're also seeing some of the other changes in things like rape and then the aggression upon each other and the shift with cold temperatures. You see different crime. It's not that you don't see any crime, it's just different crime. So it's just important to be aware of when you're operating, what you're expecting to see from your community as you travel abroad, to be aware of this as well. If you go to other countries, are they experiencing major climate shifts going on during the week you're there? Because that population will respond in kind. So it's just important to keep it in mind, but it's not just us, like I said, it's also our stuff. So this is concrete. Just the different temperatures. Again, I was in Arizona back when we still did blacktops, and this was before these heat waves. I have a purple scar on my knee where my knee seared open when I was like 6 because I tripped for like 2 seconds. So if that was then, now those are obviously significant events. That would obviously be far more damaging. But like I mentioned, park benches can get up to 125 degrees, and that's when ambient air is 83 if the direct sunlight is strong enough. So again, major concerns for your stuff, but also when we have a major flooding event, major disaster, big storm, Helene coming through, you see all the roadway damages. It's incredibly hot. Cement won't stand. It won't solidify. Same thing with epoxy. The stuff that we're building our city on the back end of these disasters takes longer to set. So this means it's going to take a lot longer to recover on the back end, which means you need to be okay for longer. Even if FEMA comes in and they repave your entire road, that road might need 2 weeks before you can drive on it. Are you good for 2 weeks? That's the major concern I want to make sure I highlight with this. But also if you're going and you're touching things like the crosswalk button, that can be searing hot. Some of our bridges, when people complain that roads are backed up in New York and in Sacramento and the bridge can't close or open because it's a drawbridge and the metal's warped because of the extreme heat, they have to spray water on it. Where are they getting that water in a drought? So these are major concerns just to be aware of as we go forward, that water fountains are getting hot, handles, doors, crosswalks, you name it. The handicap ramp, that bar has also reportedly caused burns in a couple of different areas despite it being aluminum. So it's not just our actual stuff, it's the healthcare facilities themselves being located in areas of risk, because we know that we overdeveloped a lot of these regions. We took out a lot of the trees, we put in a lot of concrete, and that reduced our shade, increased our heating margin. That's where we get the heat jungle concept that fuels thunderstorm development, also fuels the air pollution. So you can see a lot of just different issues that can come from that. Obviously, all of the people in that area at higher risk, so you're also likely going to be working a lot longer to be, one, getting seen, two, seeing others. So if anybody ends up in the healthcare sector in these regions that are darker, you're going to be facing a lot more strain, not only in personnel retention and in rotations, but in the amount of back-to-back disasters that you're going to be expected to continue to recover from at that freakishly high rate as we go forward. So when we're talking about who's going to see what kind of burden, as a fun fact, as a government worker, we don't make tons of money. We make solid money, but we don't make tons. My compressor blew at the start of this season for my HVAC system. My house is 1970s, but my HVAC was only about 4 years old. I bought the home literally 4 years prior. My compressor blew. Their response was everyone's compressor in my area blew at the same time. So they wanted $7,000 in order to replace it because everyone wanted a compressor. So I was now suddenly in the market competing with everyone else. Or I could just not. And while I know that heat illness is a problem and that overnight I could overheat and that would be a huge issue, I don't really care because $7,000 is a lot of dollars. So what I did was I went out to Home Depot and I bought one of those plug-in units and I sucked up an extra $100 a month in bills in order to just have 2 of the rooms upstairs be like cold and then downstairs was just whatever. If we're going downstairs, we might as well just walk out of the house. Like it's a fair trade-off. So when I talk to other communities where they're like, I don't want to turn on the HVAC, it costs too much money. I can't repair the HVAC. When we look at the statistics of who has HVAC where, and we say heat isn't an issue because they have HVAC, we're not tracking whether or not that works. We're just tracking that they had one. So it's really important to make sure that we're retaining when we're talking with communities that we're expressing what I did. Sure, you don't want to pay the $7,000. Totally understand. Have you thought about a heat pump? It costs about $3,000. Way cheaper, easier to install, smarter on the back end, and it gives you room by room control, unlike central air does. Like so many more selling points. Or if you can't do that, maybe you can scrounge up $100 a month. That's about a phone bill. And then you can just go to Home Depot, buy one, plug it in, pick one room of the house, and then try to funnel it into your vents. You got to work with some of these communities when you're telling them about the problem. Because if you just say it's a problem, you could die. Their notion is still like, but I can't afford it right now, or I could use that money for 10 other things that are more important. They don't take their health as seriously as they should. And that's a huge issue because you need microclimates in order to survive going forward. So when we're talking about sunny, it's getting so hot and it's so humid, what does that mean? It means 3 different states are going to hit critical wet bulb within the next 50 years. That's actually more than likely in the next 15. What that means is it's going to get so hot and so humid, there are days you can't go outside while the sun's out. It'll be too deadly. Now, we've seen some days where they warn you if you go outside, your shoes might stick to the road in Arizona, but you have not seen this kind of pain. When you sweat and you don't have it evaporate off, you essentially are wrapping yourself in saran wrap and you're cooking from the inside out. You die pretty quickly, but by the time that you realize you don't feel good, you're already beyond the threshold of healthy. So this is really important to understand because you do need HVAC. You need some level of a microclimate to escape, to cool down. You can't just jump into an ice bath. It doesn't matter if you strip at this point. It is too hot and the sweat's not going anywhere. You have to go into a place that it's evaporating off. So these are just some of the additional impacts, some of the great infographics that we put out to be able to express this. Again, not just to you, to our external workforce. On the back end of a disaster, our restoration crews are out here in these temperatures. Our first responders are out here. Firefighters are out here. FEMA crews are out here trying to get you supplies, water during a disaster when the high heat, high humidity on the back end of a hurricane. This is a deadly event when it kicks off. But again, when you look at all the different at-risk populations, who has money to really survive in these kinds of events, who has the capability, how many people are in one building if that one building loses power? So it's one customer, right? When we report power outages, we say X many customers don't have power. We don't necessarily attribute how many people are in that building when we're reporting that number. We're just like, only 10 customers, but maybe there's 120 per of those 10, and that number suddenly jumps. Being able to move resources properly is obviously a problem because one deployable generator is not going to stave off the impacts in that area. You'll also notice that kids are a big risk, as are our sports teams. They go outside in these high heat events. Even if you go out earlier in the morning, the moment the sun comes up in some of these areas, it's getting too hot, too humid. They're going out and you've been cooped up inside. It's been so hot forever. So you kind of cave on it and you send your kid out, or you go out with your kid to the park, or they go out for sporting events, or they have to do training. They can't just not do training. What are they going to do overnight? So you run into a lot of these issues, but it's also the people waiting for the buses. It's the people waiting for the trains. I took a train during a heat wave, and I also took the Greyhound on a 27-hour trip through a heat wave. I like to put myself in the same situations that they go in, so I understand it fully. It's not great. Don't recommend it. What ends up happening is everybody getting on the train platform is waiting for the train. So you're all cooking. There's no AC. You're out in direct ambient temperature, no airflow whatsoever. The train comes, you all get on the train. The train's blasting AC, but you're all insanely hot and you're sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers you don't know. Every time they stop and open the doors, more heat comes in. More hot bodies come in. It doesn't matter how fast that AC is pumping. You're adding in too much latent heat. They then, at the end of the day, it's like midnight when I did this. They dropped us all off in DC. It was 87 degrees at midnight when they dropped us in DC. A whole trainload of people had been cooking for hours. And we all got out and the yelling was just phenomenal. So when we're talking about this, to be aware that, again, it's so much more than just you or just your community. It's also people coming into your community. It's the people in the community you may not think about on the day-to-day and what they might be going through. Because you're going to interact with them. Road rage incidents are going up. Whether or not you're a safe driver doesn't really matter if everyone around you is aiming to take you off the road. So when we're looking at the community impacts, getting the information into their hands and making them make sense of it is very difficult because a lot of them don't believe it's that bad unless they've lived through it before. So your odds of getting them to commit or evacuate or take it seriously or buy something very small if they didn't survive one. You may have seen most recently one of our studies was that they don't take as seriously female named hurricanes from male named hurricanes. That's a huge problem because that's at random. That has nothing to do with anything. That list of names comes from the World Meteorological Organization and it just alternates 1-to-1. That's the only reason, and we do it every year, but alas, we've ended up with a situation where we now have to figure out what does it look like to circumvent that in the future to make sure that they're tracking it. It also ends up that a lot of our more damaging storms recently have been female named storms, so if anything, it should have been reversed. But when we're looking at a lot of this, who you're talking to is going to change the way you write your infographics, your statistics, how much emphasis you place on them, how much eye contact at conferences you give to them. That plays a huge role. Understanding who you're speaking to, who you need to move the billet on. Like, yeah, you can talk to your own climate groups, you can talk to your own medical groups. They all understand this problem, but it's really moving the needle on the hard to reach communities who don't believe you. Because they're the ones who often are raising a part of the next generation. They're passing that concern on, and then you're fighting that fight way longer than you need to. This one's a lot of fun. because of a variety of reasons. It has a lot to do with societal changes that occur during a disaster. When you tell a community they can't have something, they don't take that well. They will in-group, which is great. One, you love it when people group up during disasters because it usually makes them more resilient as a community. The downside is you just need one bad actor voice for them to all commit under one level of enthusiasm. So it's a lot to do with charisma. We had this happen in California. You'll notice Mendocino County, twice they entered into significant drought. Once, they reached out to the neighboring community, Fort Bragg, and they're like, hey, we really need some water. And Fort Bragg told them no. And they're like, in a disaster, if you ran out of water, the odds of us running out of water are too high, so we're not going to share. You are on your own. Mendocino was like, well, that's interesting because a lot of people have been stealing water from the river anyway for illegal pot farms. So why can't we just steal the water too then? So they had a whole community meeting about it where they actually talked about different ways to bring pump trucks. This is all public open source information. You can read their minutes. They were not upset about putting this out there. They were talking about creating diversion canals, which would then deplete everyone else's resources downstream. And it was very quickly becoming an every man for himself situation. We'll also see that this has happened in other situations. In Florida, most recently during Milton, they tracked who was bringing in generators for what, and they stole them. Whether the generator was for a communication tower, whether it was for a traffic light, it did not matter. They were watching to see who was towing one, because you usually tow it. So it's out in public eye, and they'll just take it. So GPS tagging any backup generators, they'll break into restaurants. It doesn't matter. If they see it, they know it's there, and they need it for their home. You'll also notice some of the other ones, some really interesting problem sets. One, price gouging, massive issue. Again, I just experienced this. The other problem is that they don't necessarily know what it is that they're stealing when they're stealing it. So we had one condo building where they had got into the chain link fenced area where we had housed water treatment for the condo building, and they took the entirety of it. So they had to saw it all out. They had to pull all these pipes out. I don't even know what they thought they were going to be doing with it, but major issues when you look at how does that condo building now get water for the next 2 weeks as they have to come in and redo all of the piping systems. No one can take showers. There's no water running, no doing laundry, nothing. That whole condo building's not viable to live in for the next 2 weeks now. Can't flush toilets. That's not hygienic. So when we're looking at this, we're also looking at some of the misinformation that can come from that. You may have seen in the news recently the attacks on FEMA on the back end of Homeland, because one individual starting a conversation pointing saying, I can't do X and they're at fault. Finger pointing like that often happens in these disasters because it's so much easier for someone to blame something. It's also why we name our storms, because it gives you the ability to blame a thing. It's a lot easier for you to feel better about the event if you can point at something and say it's that thing's fault. So if you then attribute it to a person, you can manipulate their reactions. This happens across all of our different sectors, whether it's heat or otherwise, but heat's a really easy one to employ. For those of you who don't know, your phone drops from 5G to 4G in a heat wave, then your apps will shut down on the back end, and then inevitably the phone will shut down. That's this day in order to prevent the lithium ions from popping those battery packs. You'll also notice that some of the other issues, chemicals, vapor increases in some of the different chemical deposits. We had a propane fire kick off in Arizona because propane tanks don't like temperatures over 122 degrees. And Arizona can easily reach over that, but in direct sunlight, that becomes a huge issue. So this is going to be a problem for everywhere. As you start to see temperatures start to approach 122, it doesn't need to be ambient air. It can be the surrounding surface material. I have a propane tank for my gas grill on the back end of my home. When it's incredibly hot, I've done temperatures. We got to 104 degrees in Virginia. And my propane tank was sitting at 110, and I was just sitting there watching it like, I don't know what to do with this, because if I move it, I'm holding it. So I'm not going to do that. I can't put it in the car. I put it in the backyard and it goes in a fire start. I did that. So you're just like, don't blow up, but I can't put it in the house. So you run into those kinds of issues where you're just stuck in a moment just watching something. But you'll notice that critical manufacturing, they need water for cooling, for electric, they need it for AI, they need it for the data centers, they need it to make car parts, they need it to do everything. So in areas with drought during these heat waves, major concerns for where our surface water is going. But it's not just surface water, it's also the groundwater. Because when you run out of surface water, the first thing you do is you try to pump it out from the ground, and then the ground collapses, which we're starting to see at increasing rates as well. So across the board, we're looking at this not just on the critical infrastructure side, but also telecommunications, just from the different structural concerns. So if you've ever tried to talk to a telecoms group about the threats of extreme weather events, sometimes they'll come back and they'll say, well, I have this massive cell tower. Odds of you being able to destroy it with a singular weather event are slim. And I'm like, I can find it though. Fire events going up in California, impacts to telecoms, flood events in South Asia, significant impacts to the amount of energy run into those. So that kills that. Tornadoes can take out pretty much anything they feel like taking out. As they're getting stronger, you'll notice that Helene was able to produce an EF3. So did Milton. Both of those hurricanes, typically our hurricanes only produce EF zeros to ones. They're usually very weak, but they merge now with frontal boundaries like we're going to see from the incoming hurricane in Georgia. And that's going to be where those overlap. Again, when we saw the landfall from Helene, the most damage was in North Carolina. We're going to see a very similar event kick off here going into the weekend, which will make next week really interesting as a holiday weekend. Some of the other impacts, we talked a little bit about this, the theft going up, all these other things. If you have a keypad on the external side of your building, and that keypad's in direct sunlight, you have a camera there, you have a security camera, you have a Ring doorbell, it doesn't really matter. It degrades over time during these extreme heat events, so you're not able to get in during a disaster. Same thing with extreme freezes. Flooding events can impact the sensors, so this plays a large role with being able to do security at events, security at sites. A lot of our actors now are starting to employ, this is a really interesting problem set. They're pretending to be restoration crews on the back end of a disaster and gaining access to your home because you don't have power to cross-validate whether or not they're accurate. So what they're doing is they're coming up and they're saying, oh, I do roofing. I noticed you have some hail damage. We're doing all of this other hail damage stuff. We sent a drone up. We noticed damage here. They show you either a doctored picture or a real picture. It doesn't really matter. You allow them up there. They do more damage than started with. Now your insurance won't pay you at all. So now you're immediately in a bad position and they know it. And they will surge that pricing to match that. And that becomes a bigger issue for a variety of reasons because they also gain entry to your home to get access to your attic, usually to tell you about how it's coming through and into the home. So now you've allowed them inside. They're checking all of your different access points and they're checking whether or not you have a backup generator. But they're doing this both for residential communities and for sites, and this increased into Canada this year. So you'll notice that just across the board, different impacts, supply chain, physical barrier systems, mudslides. They know when power outages persist. If you think that people aren't tracking how long North Carolina's been without power and the fact that one, they've missed critical patch updates, two, those communities are likely evacuated, no one's there. So there's a lot of different implications that can come from the back end of a disaster when the news and the media report on it. If you've been on a plane recently, you may have noticed it's more turbulent. That's going to continue to be a major issue. That's a fun thing we get to do in the military is talk about heat and the impacts to aviation. You can't do the medevacs during extreme heat days in the desert Southwest, and you can't do them over the Gulf of Mexico because it gets too hot. This has been increasing slowly, but now it's starting to increase to take over the Central Plains and portions of Florida. So when you talk about a disaster where you need to be able to move people, you can't use those helicopters. You have to start shifting how you're going to move, and then resources. Let's say that everyone needs, what was it that got impacted? Saline bags. Everyone needed IV fluids. Ran into an issue where the planes can't carry as much, trains can't carry as much, and cargo on the cargo ships can't carry as much because drought levels in the water system causing the boats to collide along the bottom. Aircraft can't get as much lift. The railways are warping, the roadways are dimpling or lifting. You run into all of these cascading impacts, and then you realize you need something and you need it now, and you're not able to get it as fast, or if you want it fast, you have to pay way more. So this is an issue across the board, not just here in the US, but globally. So when we're looking at this as a threat, again, that we're looking at who we are buying supplies from, who's our backup, are they closer, are they further, are they in a different area of a major weather disaster? I like to talk about fire weather just as a real quick nugget because we know fires are getting worse. Right now we have multiple states out east on fire, as well as the Oklahoma area, which just had tornadoes also on fire. When we're looking at what happens when you lose those trees, you lose your wind force breakup. That means every new storm that comes in, that wind is making it further and further into the grove, further into the community, drawing out more vegetation, more sunlight's making it in. Floodwaters are no longer as impeded, so they're scooping more soil. On the back end of a fire, you end up with higher levels of arsenic and mercury in the soil levels as well. So that's getting deposited into the river system at greater rates, and it's in the air at greater rates. So you can see how each one of these kind of fuels a bigger problem on the back end, but it also exposes the other trees in the grove to greater risk. So those are usually weaker trees anyway, the further you get in, which means that you will see cyclonic loss of your vegetation, which is that study there that says that if a large area of the Rocky Mountains were to burn, only about half would recover. So this is going to continue to be an issue as we go forward. As these fires continue to grow, they rapidly get out of control. They're burning far hotter because they're burning a lot more brush and a lot more scraggly brush at that. What does that do? Well, it feeds the algae blooms. It also destroys the general ecology of the region over time, but the fire doesn't have to be in your state, doesn't have to be in your county, doesn't even have to be in your region. We saw this at the fires in Canada and the smoke that came down. Everyone complained about air quality. Sure, that depositing of material got on everything from solar panels to your vegetation. What it does is it caps off a lot of the photosynthesis. It impacts the dairy that cows produce. As another secondary, it can also yield asthmatic problems going forward. And then we've seen some cognitive impairment from that. So I'll touch on that really quickly. But some of the other issues that we have is if you're in a city, you're an at-risk population who sleeps at night in the city, you usually, when you're sleeping, you're inhaling deeper. Hotter days, more pollution is available for you to inhale. You can see how this would be a correlating effect. So this is just going to continue to be a medical support issue as we go forward, is that the communities in the city will take greater risk first, but that will later be experienced by more and more people as that air pollution problem expands. Some of the other issues, I had this one, valley fever. This is a fun nugget. What it is it's a fungus that grows out west during the monsoon, dries out in the heat wave, lifts in a dust storm, and then you inhale it and it spores in your lungs. And then you end up with all these little nodules and they're your friend for like 5 years. And that's pretty much what you live with. It's just degraded air intake capability for just a couple of years, and then it goes away. Most people, it goes away, but there's no vaccine for it, and it's spreading. We've seen about a 32% increase in 2 years, but over 18 years, an 800% increase in just one state. So to be aware that this is spreading from what used to just be like 2 or 3 counties, and now it's a variety of states, and it will eventually be the entire western half of the U.S. During your lifespan, especially. So just be aware that 40% have symptoms. Only 8% go to the hospital for them. Mine wasn't even caught until I moved out east and they thought I had cancer, but I just had some fungus and it went away. So it's totally fine. When you look at some of the other fun ones, one of my favorites is on here. It's in the bottom corner. It's the brain-eating amoeba. You may have seen it in the news. It's got a 97% death rate, and the people who do survive are not great. When you're looking at where this is spreading and why, you'll notice that a lot of these states are highlighted. And it is a freshwater amoeba, but it is able to take on some saltwater characteristics now, which means it's adapting. And that's a problem for everybody. When we're looking at some of the other cascading impacts, cholera is not just a problem in some areas. It is a problem globally, and our global stockpile for the vaccine is down because of how many people are turning to these water sources in a heat wave. They need to cool down. We had a major social media implication where a bunch of people in India had a major heat wave. They got on social media. They said, oh, we should all go to this one watering hole. And about 2,000 people came down with cholera that week. So that's obviously a major inundation for the hospital system. E. coli is on the rise, especially in the desert Southwest. Different animals and people are accessing the water at varying rates throughout the week because it's so hot. So anytime that you're going to a river or a lake with your friends, to just be aware of the different signs that are likely available. But it's also the fact that our mosquitoes are increasing. So a lot of our illnesses coming over from other countries are propagating. The mosquitoes are living longer. They're breeding more often. And they're carrying with them greater risks. So being able to communicate that to first responders is a big part. It's a big task. It's making sure that they're aware of where these mosquitoes are and different things you can do to prevent breeding grounds as we go forward. Just on the last couple of slides here, talking about severe weather is a fun nugget. This is one of my favorites. Severe weather is not just the fact that Tornado Alley is, everyone in the news says it's shifting, it's expanding. So it's not shifting in the sense that one area is no longer going to see tornadoes. It's that other areas are now going to join them in the tornadic activity realm. So the Great Lakes is in there, the entirety of the Mississippi River system for the most part, but you'll notice pretty much the eastern half of the US. For those of you who didn't see 2 years ago, we had a rogue cloud form over the Capitol. So that's a major concern because DC's area usually had enough tall buildings to produce enough friction where we couldn't see tornadic activity. Some of these storms are now able to take on those additional characteristics. So cityscapes not being as safe. You'll notice Chicago reported a couple of tornadoes got into the cityscape over the last year. This is going to continue to be a major problem as these storms get stronger. We also saw melon-sized hail in Texas earlier this year, falling at about 115 miles per hour. However, a couple of years ago, we had a record set in South Dakota at bowling ball-sized hail at 150 miles per hour. So these are all increasing, hail size going up, lightning strikes going up, tornadic activity able to reach new levels. Not a lot of positive, but a lot of good information, like the winds are increasing by 5-fold. That's a fantastic statistic in the sense of statistics. Some of the damages from that, obviously with the $1 billion disaster graphic, we didn't build for these storms. We built a lot of squares and rectangles. Those don't like straight line winds, nor hail, nor tree falls. Domes would have been a better move, but we didn't do those. So some of the major city-states where our populations are going to see that, you'll notice New York City and Atlanta are expected to see a doubling of the days that severe thunderstorms could occur. Lightning goes up by about 12% per degree Celsius of warming. We're at a 1.25 degree warming over the last about year and a half, almost 2 years now. So we're starting to see these lightning strikes increasing, hail increasing, straight line winds, pretty much everything across the board. Who's going to be experiencing that? While we don't have valley fever, we get more tornadoes. So it's a trade-off. You got to pick your flavor of bad when you choose where you want to be living in the future. Crops will retain all of this. So if we think that we remember that this is bad, crops will pass it down to their little vegetative seedlings. And what that means is the next seedling will likely grow smaller to need less water. That's an evolutionary trait. So all of these areas that have drought, that have heat, that have damaging wind events, needing to plant more on the back end in order to meet the same agricultural output is a huge issue, because the more agricultural planting area you take over, the more those impacts start to amplify, like straight line winds, tornadic activity, and hail. These are just some fun graphics for everyone to be able to utilize, and you're like, how do I make this make sense for kids going back to school? People to understand the respiratory and cardiac issues from extreme heat events. The different, I mean, like, laid out on this list, it doesn't say anything positive, but it just gives you all these fun warnings. When you're outside working, a lot of the workers don't understand that it's hotter than usual. Even if it's only by a degree or two, your body just doesn't like that acclimation. A big part of climate change is not saying it's hotter than it's ever been. It's saying that it's getting hotter faster than we're able to adapt, and we didn't build to it. And that's the problem set in full. So when you're looking at this, this is the Atlas of Disaster. It's an 800-page plus document. Fantastic read if you have the time. They have this beautiful little spreader chart that ties in a lot of these different things. It's actually way bigger. You can print out like a wall-sized one. I don't have a printer that does that, but they're really interesting. I highly recommend that you read that. And if you're like, Sunny, you talk really fast and I wanted to tell my friends about it, there's YouTube videos that they made that you can slow down, because I talk this fast in those too. Some of the fact sheets that are available to you, you'll notice that I broke them down by different weather events. Our website's getting an overhaul in about 2 weeks, and there'll be even more information on it. And that's everything from me. That's about 50 minutes of just straight weather data, none of which is positive, but it's a lot of good information, and it'll help you plan in the future and take seriously some of the watches, warnings, and advisories that we put out. So with that, pending any questions, that concludes my brief. I apologize for cursing in the middle of that. Usually I'm a lot better about that. My prior command would have my head. Does everything. I don't know if we have time for, I don't know.
You've got plenty of time.
Oh, good.
1:20.
I don't know what's my head.
1:02.
Phyllis, yes, do you have a question?
Yeah, I need a hug.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, man. I feel like counselors should be made available, and sometimes at conferences they'll be like, don't forget guys, happy hours.
So this is an extreme challenge, not only for us in the high-income countries, but in low-income countries as well. And as we go forward with this, how do we resolve this challenge in humanity? You mentioned a lot that's all for us, right? What's the messaging that we can start to provide about the solutions to acknowledging that second tsunami will potentially be here, and how do we develop resiliency not only for ourselves but for those who are going to suffer even more?
Well, you'll notice that we've had those like ancient Chinese proverbs about like planting a tree in which you'll never like enjoy the shade of, right? And these generations recently have just started uprooting trees. So when we look at, we have the capability now, if we were to act, to be able to save off next generations. But for a lot of people, if they don't have kids, or if financially it's not incentivized, they're just not going to do it, because they won't be around when it reaches that point anyway. And they have no notion of mentality on it. They have enough money usually to stave off any of those impacts. So there's an unfortunate disproportion of who's going to carry the burden and who would be willing to react. So the people who are willing to take action often are not those financially capable of doing so. And that creates a bigger issue set where it's harder to move the needle unless you were to turn the consumers against them. So I'm not saying like, propaganda-wise, we should turn everybody against certain industries or anything like that, because obviously that still comes with its own notion of capability. But to be aware that while I can say like you could go out to your roof right now and paint your roof white and reduce the heating content of your home, and if you got your whole community to do it, your latent heat content of your community would go down. You're likely to see less in the way of a major damaging hail event 5 years from now. And your response is that costs money right now. And I'm like, or your roof is destroyed in 5 years, make a choice. And they're like, but it's not destroyed now. So there's an unfortunate middle ground where taking action is obviously harder than taking no action. It also costs money that people don't want to spend, that maybe they don't have. And then it's making sure that they understand what they could do about it. So creating like a beautiful laundry list or brochure of all the different fun climate like triggers that you would be able to take and say, if you're concerned about wildfires, consider doing XYZ. If you're concerned about heat waves, consider doing XYZ. And then attaching like restaurants, dollar signs. This is the cheapest thing that touches the most categories. Unfortunately, while a lot of that information could be like mass gathered into a database and then made into those brochures, that comes down to backing a solution which the government often has kind of like staved off of doing. So we've left out a lot to private sector, which has yielded a lot of this disjointed response effort. On the international scale, some people, the UK painting their railways white so that they were able to operate their train during a heat wave. Fantastic example of just going and taking action. They went out, they bought the paint from a hardware store, did very little research on what type of paint, what type of gloss. I don't know. They brought it back to the rail and they painted it by hand that night. They sent a bunch of the workers who were working overnight. They're like, paint the rail. And then in the morning, they were able to operate the rail track because it was cooler. The downside was the camera system for debris was a visual camera. And so now it didn't recognize where the rail was. The good news is you can now switch to a thermal camera, but you have to now buy a thermal camera. So each climate action that you advocate, you have to still advocate that there will be consequence to the action. There will be costs to taking the action. And it still may not end up staving off the problem. So it's a hard lift. It's a hard sell. I mean, I can give this negative briefing and be like, it's that or else. And a lot of times people are like, I would rather take the or else. And so, yeah, it's a toss up. I advocate if other people would like to, join me on the mission set of gathering the data and then, pushing it through to communities. I always take exchanges of information. I'm a big purveyor of data. So if you find a good case study, I will regurgitate it to others, like the UK's painting along with its caveat. So not a great solution to be like, I have the answer. Unfortunately, the answer is convoluted and complex, and not everyone's going to listen to it anyway. Not everyone dies at the end of the story, just many. It's just honest. Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Hi.
I'm just making sure this is, first of all, thanks for this. This is wonderful and clarifying. I like your argument of, but we didn't build this, right? And I think that could be persuasive to some segment of the population. So I guess the question is, but are we now? Why is it so hard to change building codes? How do we say, like, you can't keep building to 1970?
Yeah, the term grandfathering as an excuse to not update building codes is a very interesting problem set. Oh, my home's grandfathered, so I don't have to. Why would you want that? I get, again, the cost. That's the big issue behind it. So New Jersey is a really good, again, when you find those good nuggets that you tout them where you can. New Jersey made it so that all new builds have to build to 2100 climatological standards based off of the current modeling that's out there. So like wall outlets have to be 3 feet off the ground. Certain homes can't be built into certain floodplains before the damage occurs. So they're taking a lot of lessons learned and implementing them. The federal government can't mandate that. So the state also, in some areas, it's up to the county. So even if the state wanted to, the county might push back. Louisiana is all parishes. Alaska is all boroughs. So when you run into each different state, there, unfortunately, while you could say you shouldn't do X, Y, Z, you don't have any enforcement capability of that. You have the education, the push, the ask. It's the same thing with like our dam sector. We know that a lot of these dams haven't been maintained over the years, so they're going to face critical failure very soon. And when we say you should let the community know, should, that doesn't mean that they have to. You should use your profit margin to improve your critical infrastructure. That's a should. So a lot of
those people
unfortunately, they usually don't live where their infrastructure is at also. So when we're looking at things, when I advocate domes and everyone's like, all right, Sonny, if domes were the answer, why didn't we do domes? I've been advocating domes for about 20 years. The big problem set with domes is that they believe that if they were the housing market to allow you to build a dome home, that there wouldn't be a market to buy it on the back end. This is the sole reason. I can list off 20 reasons why that home would stand for like 150 plus years against a square or a rectangle or a colonial or a cabin. They're still not going to fund it because they believe no one will buy it should you go bankrupt or should you die. That it would just be harder for them to sell it on the back end. It'll stand a lot longer. We know this because the hurricane-proof building that they just spent all that money and research making in Florida that just made it into the news last year is a giant dome. Most of our stadiums are domes. The Coliseum, dome. Most of the pillars that we find from olden day civilizations, rounded out. Our aircraft rounded out. Our cars are all rounded. Everything that we want to sustain, we've rounded out with the exception of our buildings and our walls. Which again, when you look at things like China's Great Wall is mostly like a nice little wobble, and it push-pulls with a lot of what the natural topography was for that area. They didn't just straight line it. So it does unfortunately come down a lot to what you're willing. You can technically build whatever you want to build in most areas, but if you want to build into an HOA area and they only allow certain things, that's a huge fight to take on to get the city to change. You can make advocacies for it, but it really comes down to moving everybody at once. And that's hard.
We'll take a peek at Zoom here real quick.
I don't know.
Aisha, you stay up here with me. I think Aisha Rivera had her hand raised. Aisha, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I actually put my question in the chat, but I'll go ahead and just speak it out loud. So to your point about there being a lot of challenges at the local level, I maybe within the last couple of years reached out to the city because I was concerned that a lot of the walking paths didn't have any trees around them. And so my question to you is, are there initiatives at the federal level to encourage local governments to do things that mitigate the damages related to climate change? So, a simple intervention might be if you're encouraging everybody to walk on these sidewalks because everybody's overweight, and we know that physical activity is good for health, maybe we should plant some trees. So we're not just wasting money on sidewalks that are going to get super hot and nobody's going to use, or they're going to have a heat stroke because they went out for a walk. So that's my question.
Yeah, we actually do. FEMA does, DOE does, and a couple of the other federal side of the house have different initiatives for right tree, right place. So it's not just planting any tree, it's planting a tree that would grow into the area. Like we want to avoid eucalyptus for the rest of forever is a really good example because it's super flammable. But when we're looking at different trees, if we were to plant, for example, you were to go out and you were to buy 200 particular trees, like you really like oak, and you cover the entire walking trail in oak, and then one year you get a really bad fungus or a particular insect that comes in and it mass kills off all those trees. That's a major issue set, as well as when it gets very hot, if you're not tracking which way the sun's radiation comes in, the under canopy of the tree can actually end up overcooking and it can kill the tree prematurely. So there's a bunch of different fun threats, which a lot of the different arborists have been tracking nationally. So they've been really working both at a national and international scale, but creating a very robust national database of right tree, right place. So there is a great initiative there. Every community has a different tie into that. Each state, I believe, has at least one rep that would be able to either point you in the right direction if you're able to communicate with them, or you're able to reach out to like your city planner, because they are also moving with them to be able to plant more trees to absorb the CO2 from things like the trucking industry increasing. Some of the other trade-offs that we're seeing, not just with the planting of the trees, because that's a great advocation. It does a lot. It breaks up wind, breaks up water, cleans the air, provides shade. So that's one of those, for the smallest amount of money, causes the largest amount of impact. We also have the benefit of being able to advocate for things like the right kind of algae in a tank. A couple of different cities experimented with that in areas where you can't plant trees because it would destroy the infrastructure, the root system might be hostile, or maybe it gets too hot. And you can't plant a tree in that area. You could do an algae tank, which provides shade. The algae feeds off the direct sunlight, and some of that algae produces more cleaning effects for the air than the trees do. So there's definitely a different climate solution based off the different region that you're in. And each one comes with some level of offset from the federal government, whether it's FEMA funding for different resiliency moves. If you, for example, if you change the roof of your home to steel, the benefit from that is you don't take as much hail damage, and your insurance will decrease your bill over time. It'll pay for itself. Do they advocate for that right off the bat? No. A lot of this is individual research, which is a larger pain, or it's getting with the right people who are already doing that work. So a lot of different city planners are tied in with the new heat offices that are getting stood up in various states. So yes, there's funding, there's opportunity, there's LEED certification, Energy Star certification, which can get you tax bracket benefits if you're a large enough industry. You move a bunch of your buildings into the right way, you put trees in certain areas, you grow into the community, you can get benefits back from the federal government as well as the offset of costs. For those of you who don't know, if you can convert enough of your community or get them all on page to do something, the FEMA BRIC grant, the Building Resilience and Communities grant, is a great advocation. I sit on a couple of the different review groups for that. Getting to see different communities come in and say, we're looking at improving the way in which the floodwaters come through. We want to plant natural vegetation. We want to increase the height of the flood walls around the city. We want to prevent what is likely going to be a damaging event in a couple of years. Those are available. You just have to have enough. Essentially, it's not just going to be you and like your neighbors who get in on it. You would have to get enough people to sign in. Some of the churches also can get some of these benefits. So if you're able to move a church with your group, that you're able to advocate, you know, we're moving a shelter with us, or the church is advocating they're willing to be a shelter in a disaster. Venue managers and operators, so stadiums, major festivals, all of them are also looking at taking action. You're able to get in with a lot of these different communities to just ask, how did you pick that tree? And then take the data that they used and make use of it instead of everyone doing the same studies over and over. So I recommend anytime you see a new building coming up, like Amazon HQ2 that was going to be built. And you look at all the different pictures that came out, you could have reached out to a lot of those developers and said, how did you pick which trees? And a lot of times they will respond back to you because they're not sure why you're asking, which is great. I always recommend going that route first. Sneak the question in, and then when they ask why you want to know, just be like, I was just curious. That's how I got the paint information from the UK. Yes.
What's your strategy for, like, obviously, we're gonna have climate deniers, and there's, I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel this way, like, it's not worth it to continue to argue, because there's a certain level of, like, I'm just talking to a wall.
Oh yeah.
So, like, what is your strategy, like, to move past that? Like, if you're having an audience that will never want to listen to what you have to say.
There's quite a few of them. I present in a lot of different areas. My family are climate deniers, actually, the vast majority of them. So the good part of the argument when somebody comes up at the end of a presentation and like, why should we believe you? I had someone in Colorado do this, and they're like, why should I believe you? And my response was, I don't live here. Like, don't believe me, man. It's not my problem. It's your problem. I get some people who say, you know, it's not that bad. And my response is it bad enough though? Like, is it uncomfortable? Are you uncomfortable? Like when they said COVID wasn't that bad, and they're like, it's just the flu. And I'm like, do you want to get the flu? I don't want to get the flu. I don't care if it's just the flu. I don't care if it's just the cold. I don't even like allergies. Like if I could avoid sneezing, if I could adapt my face, I would. Again, first in line to be a cyborg, Sunny. So a lot of what I do when I'm interacting with somebody who doesn't want to hear it, the response is like, you don't like government help because you think the government is a fraud. You think the government sucks. You think that we are incapable, inept, whatever. Absorb that. Be like, cool, man. Do you want to be at the discretion of FEMA funding? Do you want them to come into your home and tell you what you're worth? Do you really want that? You want to be under me? Like, no, you don't. You want to be that, like, I provide for my family. I'm the safeguard. Cool. Then harden your home so that you don't need me on the back end of a disaster. Because that's insulting, right? The last thing you want is to need government help. That's how you talk to them. You bring it to them and you know how they talk. You know how they communicate. I tell people all the time, I love conspiracy theories. It's a big part of what I do is I absorb every conspiracy theory I can because it comes from storytelling, charisma, and the ability to manipulate society with the least amount of information to see how many people will jump on board. That's important to be able to take that, learn from it, and apply it to what you're doing scientifically because we speak a lot of science. They speak a lot of high energy. Oh my God, you wouldn't believe. And you're like listening to a bunch of, I don't know if you've ever gone to some of these engineering seminars, but like it's a lot of monotone. Here's some slides, here's some good data. And then I'm over here like, everyone dies at the end. And everyone's like, oh my God, Sunny, I've never heard that. I'm like, you actually have. You've heard it like 20,000 times. You just haven't heard it with somebody like doing this a bunch. There's a lot of that kind of societal manipulation you have to throw in with the data that you're giving. Don't give them everything if they don't want to hear everything. Scale it to their pain point. Cool, man, you want your barbecue to float away? You know how much those cost on the back end if everyone's got to buy one? My God, man, you know all that meat you have in the freezer? All of that goes bad in a heat wave. Is that what you want? Power outages. You don't own that substation. You don't know what they're doing. What are they doing over there? You should go ask. Like, these are really easy ways to kind of just plug that nugget into their brain. When you look at the back end of Helene and the damage to the North Carolina communities, a lot of them came back and they were like, this was not forecasted. We weren't warned. And I was like, that's crazy. It was in the models 5 days in advance. We saw that. Actually, we knew specifically you were going to get exactly the amount of rain that you got. I can actually showcase that because I have the studies from back then in the warnings I put out. So it's like, so not only did we know it was going to happen, we knew exactly your community was going to get slapped with it. And they're like, why didn't you do something? Oh, it's not on me. That's on your community leader. That guy you elected, that's between you and him, man. I don't know. I warned him. That data was out there. You could have seen it coming. You could have done something. Where do I go to get that data? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Here, here, and here. And then you can beat them to it. And then you can ask them why they're not doing something. Hold them accountable. A lot of times when people are like, Sunny, you know, like, how do we move the ball forward? We've been using the carrot a lot. And I would advocate that sometimes it's easier to tell them to, you know, use the stick. If they elected someone and that community fails, technically it's that person who should have been communicating with the community. Now, I'm not saying that like we should like revolt on our people or anything. I'm just saying like hold people accountable to the scientific data that is available out there and make sure that they know where to go to get the valid information. The last thing you want, I don't know if you guys saw this on the back end of Milton, a bunch of people got on TikTok and they were looking at the long range model of the GFS and they're like, there's a super storm coming that's going to wipe Florida off the face of the earth. The Democrats have a weather machine. They're doing it on purpose so we can't vote. And I was like, that's crazy. Why would you vote for the side that doesn't have the weather machine also? I'm just saying. But like, when we talk about those and we talk about the people and the misinformation they're giving, and they're like, this massive superstorm, and I'm like, but there's nothing there right now. And people will be like, well, when is it gonna be? And I'm like, look, nothing there, nothing there. That TikToker, there's nothing there. Models can't pick up on it like that. It's so important to meet them at every nugget. So it might be exhausting, absolutely, 100%, but you can make it fun. And I recommend that. Find the conspiracy theories.
We are at time, but thank you so much, Sonny. One more question about chronic kidney disease with some of the.
Kidney, like just very briefly mentioned, it's either on the slide for the Too Hot to Op, or it's in the notes section of Too Hot to Op.
Okay.
Kidney disease is an interesting problem set because there's so many more studies coming out at the same time about like the various tie-ins to kidney disease. So I do recommend also looking into those, but also dialysis during extreme heat or flood or winter storms, huge problem set. But that's definitely a far bigger problem than just a heat wave.
So King, we'll get those slides that pushed out to you. Take a look at it yourself, but.
I'm not the most conventional speaker, but I'm a lot of fun.
That's it. Well, thank you all, man. Thank you, Sonny.